The first time I realized my family had erased me, it wasn't in a courtroom or over a screaming argument. It was in an airport thousands of miles from home, when a man in a pressed royal uniform lifted a sign with my name on it and said calmly, "Ma'am, the Queen would like to see you." I remember standing there, jet-lagged, my service bag still cutting into my shoulder, thinking he had the wrong person. People like me don't get summoned by queens. We get thanked quietly, if at all. We learn to walk away without applause. And yet, as I stared at that sign, the memory that flooded my mind wasn't the flight or the uniform. It was a single piece of paper, a thin envelope, and 4 words that had followed me across the ocean. "Guess he didn't love you much." That's where this really began. 2 weeks earlier, I had been sitting in a lawyer's office, back home in Virginia, my hands folded the way the Army taught me to fold them, still composed, unreadable. The room smelled like old books and lemon cleaner. On the wall hung a framed photograph of my grandfather in uniform, taken decades ago when his back was straight and his eyes still believed in order. He had been a general, a real one, not a desk ornament. He earned every star the hard way. Korea, early Vietnam advisory years. Joint operations most people will never read about. He had also been a man of few words. My parents sat across from me, already relaxed, already victorious. My mother's pearls clicked softly when she crossed her arms. My father leaned back as if the chair belonged to him by right. In their minds, the day was already over. The lawyer cleared his throat and read the will. The mansion went to my parents. The surrounding land, the accounts, the investments, the metals, everything that could be framed, sold, or displayed. I felt nothing. Not shock, not anger. I'd learned long ago that my place in this family was always conditional. Then the lawyer paused and slid a single envelope across the desk toward me. "This was left for you," he said. "Just one." My mother smiled. Not kindly, not cruelly either, just satisfied. I opened it slowly. Inside was a folded note, written in handwriting I recognized, but not entirely. It looked like my grandfather's, but stiffer somehow. Forced. "Dear daughter, guess he didn't love you much." That was it. No signature, no explanation. The room stayed silent. No one rushed to comfort me. No one apologized. My parents didn't even look surprised. They looked relieved. I folded the paper carefully and placed it back in the envelope. I didn't cry. I didn't ask questions. I thanked the lawyer for his time, stood up, and walked out. That was the most offensive thing I could have done. Growing up, I was never the easy child. I joined the service when they wanted me in business school. I chose discipline over inheritance duty over comfort. My grandfather never stopped me. He never encouraged me either. He simply watched. And in his world, watching was everything. After the funeral and the will, I packed a single bag. I had already been scheduled to participate in a veterans advisory exchange overseas, something quiet, symbolic, mostly ceremonial. The kind of thing generals used to do after wars ended when alliances needed maintenance more than headlines. My parents didn't ask where I was going. At the airport, I looked back once at the place I had grown up. The house was already buzzing with realtors and contractors. The mansion was being measured, priced, planned. I boarded my flight without a word. When I landed overseas, the air was colder than I expected. Gray sky, clean lines. The kind of place where people still believe institutions matter. That's when I saw him. The driver stood near the arrivals gate. Posture, perfect, uniform, immaculate. He didn't scan the crowd nervously. He waited patient, as if time itself had been trained to obey him. When his eyes met mine, he lifted the sign. My full name, rank included, "Ma'am," he said with a slight bow, "Her Majesty requests your presence." I laughed once, quietly. Not because it was funny, but because it was impossible. "There must be a mistake," I said. "I'm just here for a veterans program." He nodded. "Yes, we are aware." Then he added something that made my breath stop. "Your grandfather spoke of you often. No one had ever said that to me before." As we drove through streets lined with stone and history, I felt something unfamiliar pressing against my ribs. Not pride, not fear, recognition. For the first time since that envelope slid across the desk, I wondered if the note had really been my grandfather's voice at all. And for the first time in my life, I understood that silence, real silence, doesn't mean absence. Sometimes it means preparation. By the time the car reached the palace gates, I had stopped trying to explain the situation to myself. Military life teaches you something civilians often struggle with. You don't waste energy fighting facts. You observe. You listen. You wait. The driver didn't speak again until we arrived. He opened the door, nodded once, and said, "Please follow me, ma'am." Inside, there was no spectacle, no photographers, no dramatic music playing in my head. Just quiet hallways, polished floors, and people who moved with purpose, but never hurry. It reminded me of command buildings back home, the ones where decisions were made behind closed doors, and lives changed without noise. I was escorted into a modest sitting room. No gold thrones, no theatrics. Just a fireplace, a tea service, and a woman in her late 70s, seated upright, her posture sharper than most officers I'd known. She stood when I entered. "I am glad you came," she said, extending her hand. "Your grandfather spoke of you with respect." That word again, respect. I didn't know what expression crossed my face, but she noticed it. "You were surprised," she said gently. "So was he when he first met you." We sat. Tea was poured. The fire crackled softly, the kind of sound you don't notice until it's gone. She told me about a time long before I was born, when my grandfather had been sent quietly to advise during a political crisis. No press, no medals, just duty. He had helped stabilize a situation that could have turned violent. He refused recognition, insisting the work mattered more than the credit. He spoke little, she said. But when he did, people listened. I swallowed. That sounded like the man I knew. Then she said something that tightened my chest. "He told us you were his greatest concern." I waited for the explanation. It came slowly. He had worried that the world would misunderstand me, that my family would mistake my silence for weakness, that they would reward obedience instead of character. He believed, she continued, that true inheritance should test the soul, not flatter the ego. I thought of the envelope, the note, the calculated cruelty of it. Before I could speak, she slid a folder across the table. Inside were documents, legal, international, carefully dated and notarized. A trust, established decades ago. Its beneficiaries families of fallen service members, educational programs, and at the very end, one individual named as final steward, me. I didn't touch the papers. I didn't come for money, I said quietly. She smiled. He knew that. What I felt then wasn't joy. It was clarity. Back in the States, my parents were likely celebrating, toasting to a life well played. They had the mansion, the proof, the visible symbols. They believed the story was over. I stayed overseas for several days. Not hiding, not plotting, just listening, learning, understanding the man my grandfather had been when no one was watching. On the flight home, I reread the copied original letter preserved in the Trust's archive. It was nothing like the note I'd received. It spoke of pride, of restraint, of trust in my judgment, of love that didn't announce itself. By the time I landed back in Virginia, I had made a decision. I would not confront my parents. Not yet. I returned to my small townhouse, the one they'd never visited, because it wasn't impressive enough. I unpacked slowly, folded my clothes, hung my old service jacket in the closet. A week passed. Then two. My phone rang. My mother's voice was brittle, forced cheerful. "Your father and I were wondering," she said, "if you'd like to come by. There are some documents we need you to sign." I almost smiled. "Of course," I said. "Whenever you're ready." When I arrived at the mansion, it already felt different. Larger, emptier, like a museum pretending to be a home. They talked about renovations, about legacy, about how proud my grandfather would have been of them. I listened. Quietly, I signed nothing. A month later, the first letter arrived. Then another. Questions, inquiries, audits. My parents didn't know where they were coming from. They didn't know why banks suddenly wanted clarification, why certain documents were being reviewed more closely. They looked at me differently then, not accusing, just uncertain. I never raised my voice, never accused them of forgery, never mentioned the Queen. Silence did what shouting never could. At night alone, I reread my grandfather's real words. I thought about how easily people confuse loudness with strength. And I waited, because in my experience, justice doesn't arrive with sirens. It arrives with paperwork. The first official notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, folded neatly into a white envelope with a return address my parents didn't recognize. I knew what it was before they called me. My mother's voice was tight, the way it used to get when something slipped beyond her control. "They're asking questions," she said, "about your grandfather's accounts. Some of them don't match what we were told." I pictured her standing in the great room of the mansion's sunlight, pouring through windows she believed proved success. She had always trusted appearances. My grandfather never had. "I'm sure it's nothing," I replied. And I meant it, not because nothing was wrong, but because nothing was accidental. After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and let the memories come back slow and steady. Not the public version of my grandfather, the uniformed photographs, the medals locked behind glass, but the quieter man I knew. The one who rose before dawn, drank his coffee black, and believed the hardest work should leave the least trace. He never talked about his other war, as he called it once, almost jokingly. I had been in my 20s, then newly commissioned, still believing that recognition mattered. I remember asking him why he never told stories. He looked at me for a long time before answering. "Because the best ones aren't for telling," he said. "They're for surviving." I didn't understand him then. I do now. The second call from my parents came a week later. This time, my father spoke. He sounded irritated, not afraid yet, but annoyed in the way men get when systems they thought they understood begin to question them. "They want original copies," he said. "Signatures, letters, things we don't have." I imagined him flipping through file drawers, realizing how thin their certainty really was. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that my grandfather had never trusted permanence in one place. He had seen too many regimes fall, too many truths rewritten. He spread his records like seeds, some planted close to home, others far away. That was the general's other war. Not fought with weapons, but with foresight. During my time overseas, I had been allowed to review parts of his private correspondence. Carefully, respectfully. Much of it was redacted, but enough remained to show a pattern. Quiet meetings, Joint task forces, advisories conducted under agreements that never made headlines, and always the same condition: no public acknowledgement. One letter stood out. It wasn't addressed to a head of state or a defense minister. It was written to a young officer me. Not mailed, not delivered, preserved. He wrote about watching me choose service over comfort, and how that choice told him everything he needed to know. You understand, he wrote, that duty doesn't always come with gratitude. That is why I trust you. Trust. That word carried more weight than any inheritance. Back home, the pressure mounted. The bank froze certain transfers. A review committee requested clarification on alterations made to estate documents shortly after my grandfather's death. Alterations. My parents still didn't accuse me outright, but the air changed. Conversations became guarded. Invitations stopped. When I did visit, they watched me the way people watch a door they fear might open on its own. One evening, my mother finally said what she had been circling for weeks. "You never seemed upset about the will," she said. "Most people would be." I met her gaze. I was raised not to confuse possessions with worth. She looked away. A few days later, I was contacted formally by an international legal firm, one that specialized in legacy trusts connected to military and diplomatic service. The same one I'd met overseas. They informed me politely and without drama that I was now required to participate in proceedings as a named steward. Not heir, steward. The difference mattered. I drove past the old base where I'd trained years ago, the gate still bearing faded paint and familiar warnings. I parked, stepped out, and stood there, longer than necessary. This place had taught me patience. It had taught me how to endure unfairness without losing shape. My parents thought they were fighting me. They weren't. They were facing my grandfather, finally, just not in uniform. That night, I placed the altered note and the original letter side by side on my table. The contrast was painful. One reduced love to a taunt. The other trusted me with responsibility. I understood then that the real inheritance wasn't hidden money or foreign recognition. It was the burden of doing what was right when no one applauds. And the war my grandfather had fought all those years ago, the quiet one, wasn't finished yet. He had simply passed it on. By the time the formal notice arrived, naming me as a required witness, not a beneficiary, I understood exactly what my grandfather had done. He hadn't tried to protect me from pain. He had trusted me to endure it without losing myself. That distinction matters more with age. The letter came on heavy paper, the kind meant to discourage careless handling. It requested my presence for a preliminary review regarding discrepancies in the estate documents filed shortly after my grandfather's death. No accusations, no threats, just facts lined up neatly, waiting for daylight. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after reading it, hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold. In the quiet memories surfaced not dramatic ones, not the kind families tell at reunions, but the small, easily overlooked moments that shape a life. My grandfather teaching me how to shine my shoes when I was 12. Not because I needed shiny shoes, but because details mattered. Him correcting my posture at the dinner table without a word, just a tap on the back of my chair. Correction without humiliation. He never said "I love you." He never had to. When I finally went to see my parents again, the mansion felt less like a victory and more like a liability. Boxes lined the hallways. Contractors came and went. The place was being reshaped to impress people my parents didn't even like. My mother poured coffee with a trembling hand. "You could help us," she said suddenly. "Clear this up." Tell them it was all in order. I studied her face. The woman who raised me. The woman who had taught me to smile at church and keep family business private. The woman who had slid that envelope across the table without flinching. What exactly would you like me to say? I asked. That your father didn't change anything. She replied, too quickly, that the note was exactly as written. I nodded once, slowly. That was the moment I knew reconciliation would never come through denial. I can't do that, I said. Not harshly, not emotionally, just honestly. Her shoulders sagged, and for the first time, I saw something close to fear in her eyes. Not fear of punishment, fear of exposure, of being seen clearly. A few days later, I was invited to review the full overseas archive, tied to the trust this time through secure digital access. I spent hours reading correspondence my grandfather had never intended me to see, unless it became necessary. In one entry, he described my parents with precision, but without cruelty. He noted their ambition, their fixation on appearances, their tendency to mistake control for leadership. They mean well, he wrote, but they listen to themselves more than to truth. He also wrote about me. She does not speak often. That is her strength. Silence leaves room for conscience. That line stayed with me. The legal teams moved carefully, quietly. My role was limited and precise. I confirmed timelines, verified handwriting, identified inconsistencies without commentary. At no point did I request restitution. At no point did I suggest punishment. And yet, the weight shifted. My parents' attorneys stopped sounding confident. Meetings grew shorter. Their voices, once so assured, now strained to maintain composure. One evening, my father called me alone. No speakerphone, no background noise. You always were closer to him than we realized, he said. I chose my words carefully. He saw us all clearly. That's different. Silence filled the line. Heavy, unavoidable. What happens now? He finally asked. I looked out the window at my small yard, where nothing glittered and everything was real. That depends, I said, on how much truth you're willing to face. The following week, I testified, briefly, factually, without editorial. I confirmed that the note I received did not match my grandfather's known writing patterns. That similar inconsistencies appeared in other documents. That overseas records supported an alternate narrative. I did not speculate on motive. I didn't need to. Afterward, I walked out of the building alone, the way I'd walked out of that lawyer's office weeks earlier. But this time, something had shifted. Not externally, internally. For years, I had believed that being overlooked was a form of punishment, that silence meant rejection, that love, if it existed, would have announced itself more clearly. I was wrong. Love, the kind my grandfather practiced, doesn't interfere. It prepares. That night, I laid both letters, the altered note and the preserved original, back into their respective folders. One would soon be part of a legal record. The other would remain what it had always been, a private truth. And as I turned off the light, I realized something else had been left unspoken all along. My grandfather had never doubted me. He had doubted the world's ability to recognize quiet integrity. So he built a test instead. And now that test was almost complete. By the time autumn settled over Virginia, the leaves outside my townhouse turned the color of old brass. I liked that season best. Things didn't end abruptly in the fall. They let go, gradually with dignity. I returned to my routine as if nothing unusual were happening. Morning walks, volunteering twice a week at the Veterans Center, a part-time advisory role that kept my mind sharp without demanding attention. I didn't post anything online. I didn't answer questions that weren't asked. From the outside, it probably looked like I'd lost. My parents, meanwhile, were learning what it felt like to live under observation. Not surveillance, nothing so dramatic. Just scrutiny. Banks asked for clarifications. Title companies paused transactions. Longtime acquaintances grew cautious, sensing instability the way animals sense weather. One afternoon, my mother showed up unannounced at my door. She stood on the step longer than necessary before knocking, as if hoping the house might answer for her. "I don't understand why you're doing this," she said, once we sat down. "You already made your point." I poured tea. The kettle whistled, then fell silent. "I'm not doing anything," I said. "I'm letting the process work." She shook her head. "That process doesn't care about us." "That's the idea," I replied. She studied my living room, the modest furniture, the framed photos from my service years, the absence of anything meant to impress. "You could have had so much more," she said softly, not accusing, almost pleading. I met her eyes. "I already do." She left without another word. The next weeks passed in fragments, emails forwarded by attorneys, polite requests for verification confirmations that didn't require my opinion. I learned to recognize the sound of a system correcting itself. It wasn't loud. It was methodical. My parents began to avoid me in public. When we did cross paths, they spoke carefully, as if afraid anything they said might become evidence. It was a strange reversal. I had grown up walking on eggshells around their expectations. Now, they navigated around my silence. One evening, my father called and asked if we could talk. We met at a diner halfway between our homes, the kind of place where the coffee is always too hot and the waitresses call everyone hon. He looked older, smaller somehow. "They're saying we might lose the house," he said, without preamble. I stirred my coffee. "That depends on the findings. You know we never meant to hurt you," he added quickly. I paused. Intent doesn't undo impact. He flinched at that, then sighed. "We thought we were protecting the family," he said. "Your grandfather was complicated." "He was clear," I replied. "We just didn't all listen." We sat in silence for a while, the clatter of dishes filling the space between us. I didn't offer solutions. He didn't ask for forgiveness. It was the most honest conversation we'd had in years. When winter came, so did the court date. I attended only when required, sat where I was told, spoke when addressed. My testimony again was brief, factual, unemotional. I answered questions the way I'd been trained directly without embellishment. My parents' attorneys argued intent, confusion, timing. The documents argued back. In the end, the ruling didn't make headlines. No reporters waited outside. No one cared except the people involved, and that was enough. Certain assets were reassigned. Penalties were assessed. The mansion, stripped of its symbolic weight, became just another property tied up in resolution. Afterward, I stood on the courthouse steps and felt something close to relief, not because I'd won, but because the waiting was over. That evening, I returned home and opened the small wooden box my grandfather had once given me. Inside were items he'd never cataloged: a compass, a worn photograph, a note written in his unmistakable hand. "Hold steady. Let truth move at its own pace." I smiled for the first time in weeks. The next day, I received confirmation that the trust would proceed as intended. Scholarships funded, families supported, programs expanded. My role formalized, not as owner, but as guardian. I accepted without ceremony. When my parents called later that night, their voices were subdued. "What happens now?" my mother asked. I thought for a moment. "Now," I said, "we decide what we're willing to learn." There was no shouting, no blame, just the quiet recognition that something had been lost and something else preserved. I hung up and sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. I had returned with nothing to prove, and in doing so, I had finally come home. By the time the final hearing was scheduled, winter had settled in fully. The kind of winter that doesn't shock you with snowstorms, but presses in slowly, day after gray day, until everything unnecessary feels heavy. I arrived at the courthouse early, as I always did. Old habits from service never leave you. I sat on a wooden bench and watched people file in, lawyers with rolling briefcases, clerks clutching folders, men and women who believed this room would decide who they were allowed to be next. My parents arrived together, but didn't sit beside me. That separation said more than any argument ever could. When the judge entered the room, stood, the sound of chairs scraping against the floor echoed longer than usual. I thought of my grandfather then, and how much he valued order, not because it was rigid, but because it created space for fairness. The proceedings moved slowly, intentionally. Documents were reviewed line by line. Handwriting experts explained differences that only patience could reveal. Dates were compared. Witnesses spoke about processes, not feelings. When it was my turn, I was sworn in and asked to state my name. I did so clearly. The attorney asked me whether I had altered any documents related to my grandfather's estate. No, I said. Whether I had instructed anyone else to do so. No. Whether I had benefited financially from the discrepancies under review. No. Each answer landed without drama. That was the point. Then came the question I'd expected. Did you believe the note you received reflected your grandfather's true intentions? I paused, not for effect, but because the truth deserved space. No, I said finally, it did not. I explained why. Not emotionally, not defensively. I referenced patterns, habits, the man I had known. The letter preserved overseas, written in the same hand, with the same economy of language he had always used. I didn't look at my parents while I spoke. I didn't need to. Their attorneys argued mitigation. They spoke of grief, confusion, timing. They asked the court to consider the emotional state of a family in mourning. The judge listened, took notes, asked questions that cut cleanly through the noise. In the end, the ruling was measured. Certain actions were deemed intentional, others reckless. Consequences were assigned accordingly. Not vindictive, not lenient, just accurate. As the gavel came down, I felt no rush of victory, only the quiet satisfaction that comes when something distorted is finally set straight. Outside, the cold air felt sharp and honest. I stood on the steps while people dispersed their conversations, dissolving into the hum of ordinary life. My parents approached me then, not together. My father spoke first. His voice was low-stripped of the confidence that had once filled rooms. We should have trusted him, he said. I nodded. He trusted us to choose wisely. My mother looked at me, eyes rimmed, red, but dry. Is there anything we can do now? I considered that carefully. You can tell the truth, I said, even if only to yourselves. She pressed her lips together, then nodded once. That was the closest thing to an apology we would ever have. That evening, I returned home and opened my laptop. I finalized paperwork, confirming the trust's next phase, expanding scholarships for children of service members, funding counseling programs for families navigating post-service transitions, supporting leadership education rooted in ethics rather than ambition. It felt right, necessary. Before closing the file, I added a single line beneath my signature in honor of those who serve without expecting recognition. I slept deeply that night, for the first time in months. The next morning, I received a message from the overseas legal office. Brief, respectful. Your grandfather's intentions have been fully restored. I read it twice. Silence had spoken, not through anger or spectacle, but through patience and record. And justice, when it finally arrived, had done so quietly, exactly the way he would have wanted. Spring arrived without announcement. One morning, the trees outside my townhouse simply decided to bloom, as if they'd been waiting for permission that finally came. I noticed it on my way back from the Veterans Center. The air softer the light, less demanding. It felt like a season, earned not given. I met my parents a week later, not at the mansion. No one called it that anymore, but at a small park near the river, where my grandfather used to walk when his knees still allowed it. We sat on a bench, worn smooth by time and weather. There were no lawyers, no folders, just three people in the truth between us. My father spoke first. He always did when he was afraid of losing control. We won't get it back, he said. The house, the status. I watched the river move past us, steady and indifferent. That was never the point. My mother nodded slowly. We wanted him to be proud. He was, I said, just not of the things you thought. They didn't argue. That mattered. We talked about ordinary things after that. Health, neighbors, the way age narrows your world until honesty becomes unavoidable. When we stood to leave, my mother reached for my arm and held it for a moment longer than necessary. I'm sorry, she said. Not loudly, not perfectly, but sincerely enough to count. I accepted it the way my grandfather would have, without ceremony, without reopening wounds. Reconciliation, I've learned, isn't about restoring the past. It's about agreeing not to poison the future. The Trust's first scholarship ceremony was held that summer. No banners, no press. Just a small room, a few families and young people who had lost more than they ever admitted out loud. I stood at the back and listened as names were called. When one young woman thanked whoever made this possible, I felt my throat tighten, not with pride, but with responsibility. Afterward, I walked outside and dialed a number I hadn't called in a long time. The palace office answered politely, efficiently. Please tell Her Majesty, I said, that the work continues. They understood. At home, I placed my grandfather's compass on the shelf by the window. It didn't point north anymore, not accurately, but it reminded me that direction isn't always about precision. Sometimes it's about intention. In the quiet evenings, I reread his original letter, the one that never reached me until it had to. I didn't memorize it. I didn't frame it. I let it be what it was meant to be, a private acknowledgement, not a public reward. People have asked me since then if I regret not taking more. The house, the money, the chance to make them pay. I tell them the truth. Revenge is loud. It demands witnesses. It leaves debris. Justice, the kind that lasts, doesn't need an audience. It restores balance and steps aside. My grandfather knew that. So did the Queen. So do the quiet men and women who serve, come home, and rebuild without applause. If there's a lesson here, one worth carrying forward, it's this: character reveals itself under pressure, but honor reveals itself over time, not in what we claim, but in what we protect, not in what we inherit, but in what we refuse to misuse. As I write this, the river keeps moving. The scholarships keep funding. The programs keep helping families find their footing again. My parents are learning how to live with less noise and more truth. And I am learning still how to carry responsibility without letting it harden me. If you've stayed with me this long, I hope you'll pause for a moment and consider the quiet tests in your own life, the ones no one else sees, the ones that ask not for reaction, but for restraint. If this story stirred something in you, memory, reflection, resolve, share it with someone who understands the weight of silence. And if you believe as I do, that real honor doesn't shout, then you already belong here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering. And thank you for choosing what remains.